We've all heard of helicopter parents and the impacts of AI on the next generation of workers. But how does that impact how we hire and help prepare those younger workers for leadership skills? In this episode of Leading with Instinct, we're going to talk about what horses can teach us about building resilience for our next generation of workers.
This is the Leading with Instinct podcast, focusing on intuitive leadership and fostering deep team connections through equine experiential leadership development and coaching. Brought to you by KatieTheCoach.com and the Collaboration Partners. Now, here's your hosts, Katie Navarra-Bradley and Ginny Telego.
Two recent Wall Street Journal reports document a striking shift in how parents are showing up in their adult children's careers. There's one staffing firm in Alaska described having to fire the same 24-year-old employee twice in one day. Once in a conversation with the individual himself, and then again a few hours later with the employee's mother, who called in pleading for a second chance. Career coach Jasmine Escalera has a name for this broader pattern: co-piloting. Parents are calling hiring managers, applying for jobs on their adult children's behalf, and sitting just off camera on video interviews to help them with answers or walk them through benefits packages. The scale of this is what really stands out. There was a Zeddy survey of more than 1,000 Gen Zers who found that 1 in 5 had a parent attend a job interview with them. At the Society for Human Resource Management National Conference this year, a presenter asked a room of 250 HR professionals whether a parent had ever contacted them on behalf of a young employee or interview candidate. More than half of them raised their hand. In this episode, we're going to unpack this trend and contrast it to the more time-tested model of how lead mares and older horses within a herd prepare their young foals for independence. Lead mares do not shield foals from every correction, and they let the herd teach them the hard lessons so that when the stakes are real, that young horse knows how to react. So, Ginny, what are your thoughts? I heard you kind of chuckle a little bit. What are your thoughts of some of these trends that are showing up?
Oh, well, first, it's so great to see you, Katie. And I'm excited to be here today for our conversation. I read this article and I wasn't surprised because I've known this has been going on for quite a while. My husband worked in residence life a long time ago in his previous career at a university, and this was something that he dealt with on a regular basis. And so what I thought was interesting is the prevalence of it, but also understanding where it might be coming from. And, we can talk about that a little bit more. But as I read the article, the thing that did come to me was the fact of having observed herds of horses for a long time and young horses within the herd. I thought, wow, the horses know that they need to prepare the younger members of the herd to be able to operate in a way that not only keeps themselves safe, but keeps the herd safe. So I'm looking forward to us unpacking this a little bit and sharing some of how the instinctual nature of how horses lead their herds can maybe help us start thinking about how we can make sure that we're preparing the next generations of leaders in particular, to be able to be confident in operating on their own.
That's such a great point, too. You called out that we're going to dig in a little bit into where some of this comes from, because every generation has a stereotype, right? And everybody loves to say that it's because Gen Z wants a lot of handholding. And when we get into unpacking this, that's not necessarily the case.
Right.
Maybe in some cases, but not in every case. And it really begs that bigger question, what are we costing them if we don't give them that independence and teach them to be able to hold their own ground? And so I look forward to kind of talking with you about, I know we're going to talk a lot about young horse herd behavior and what we've seen in some of our programs, and think that, our listeners will have a lot to take away today.
For sure. And I think, if we kind of look at this as this question, what you just brought up, right? Because in the herd, and there's natural consequences for
Yep.
young horses when they do something that isn't acceptable to the herd. And, if they don't learn what the boundaries are, what's acceptable, what's expected of them, if they don't learn those things, then they're going to struggle. They're going to struggle to be part of the herd. They're going to, struggle to build relationships within the herd. And so they have to learn, like, how do I read what's happening in the herd, right? They have to learn the energy communications, the body language in particular, that if you don't pay attention to that, it can have a real consequence. And so I think if we look at this within this context of how do we do this for our young professionals, I think that we can reduce the cost of them not being ready, right, or not bringing to the table what they're capable of. Because another article that I got from the Wall Street Journal on this was one called "Forget About Fetching Coffee. This summer, the interns are running the show." And it's a really interesting dichotomy to the assumptions that people are making about younger generation in the workforce right now. So, yeah. So where do you want to dive into this, Katie?
Yeah, well, let's start. We talked about how parents are applying for children on their kids' behalf. They're coaching them off camera. They're even disrupting and disputing performance reviews or
Yeah.
calling in sick for their kids.
Yeah.
You know, in full transparency, I do not have children myself. So I don't want this to come across like I'm offering parenting advice. But as we get into the conversation, I'll share some examples of how my parents were involved in the process without actually doing the process, and how that ties back to what we see in our horse herds. You when you shared these Wall Street Journal articles with me, one of them in there mentioned that there's a talent acquisition director at the Long Island Health System who describes a mother that showed up at a job fair with a daughter's resume, really trying to help this daughter. And the recruiter didn't necessarily think that the mother should leave, but she kept trying to engage with the individual because the individual is who she was hiring. And so, I think that there's a lot of skill and leadership skills within that of
Mm-hmm.
how do you navigate when you're in that position of not making the other person feel uncomfortable, but also getting to the person that you really need to talk to, because at the end of the day, they are the ones that are going to be working in your offices.
Absolutely. And yeah, also I do not have children, but I have mentored a lot of young people, and I walk alongside parents quite a bit when I used to coach riding, and oftentimes had parents, appreciating that I was another resource for their teenagers and college students. And so I look at it through that lens, right? When I was coaching young people, and when I've done leadership development with high school and college age students in particular, one of the things that I really tried to impart on them was that failure doesn't mean you are a failure, right? If something doesn't work out, it doesn't mean you're a failure. And that's a really big thing. That's a big thing for a lot of people. And I think for Gen Z, I think it shows up quite a bit of not wanting to fail. There's a lot of anxiety around that, or perceived failing. And also, though, one of the things that I have noticed is, parents put their own reputation on their kids, right? Which makes sense. Like your kids are a reflection potentially of your parenting is kind of the assumption out there. Now, I don't think that's always true, because people make decisions, and I've seen some really, really great parents who have had kids that have made bad decisions, right? But I can see, though, where parents really want their adult kids to be successful. So they want them to get the right job, a good job, all of these things, which is great. And I love that parents are so supportive of that, and they're working to help their kids be successful in it. So the question becomes, where's that line, right? Of letting them go and do job interviews, make the mistakes that they're going to make in the interview process, not get hired, and be able to come back. Because to me, what this is about building resilience.
Mm-hmm.
Because parents aren't going to always be able to step in. At some point in time, our parents aren't here, unfortunately. And so, I think the sooner that you can get your kids building resilience and being able to handle these conversations, handle, not getting a job, handle getting feedback that's not exceeds expectations. We can't exceed expectations all the time. None of us can do it. But also, I'm kind of thinking as I was reading that, and you and I were talking, is the not exceeding expectations piece about the kid, or is it about the parents are thinking, well, I did everything right, why isn't my kid exceeding expectations in their job?
Mm-hmm. Mm. It's interesting you say that. I have two friends and colleagues that I work with. We're all contractors on a project, and their conversations have come up recently. The other reality is this is a very difficult job market.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yep.
both of their children, one in particular, has a master's, and so they really want to work at this one particular company, and they've been called for interviews 7 times, and they'll either be told that the jobs that are open are for high school level and with an MBA they're too qualified, or they're not qualified enough. And it's challenging because in these two particular individuals' cases, they're also not as comfortable going out and networking and meeting new people, and that is tough. And I personally feel part of that is a product of all of the digital communication that we have, because
Right.
you don't have all of the life experiences of that uncomfortable interacting with people you do and don't know. And so it also makes it really challenging for parents, I think, during this time when they have kids who really are trying, and
Right.
the reality of what's going on is making it very difficult, and they just want to help, right? And there are some edge cases where parents really can help, and it's not this helicoptering. There was a marketing executive who published a LinkedIn post asking his network to help his daughter, who was a recent graduate, find an entry-level role. He admitted that it was a little bit helicoptering, but he also called it networking assistance, to just use the connections that he had built through his career. His daughter went on the interviews on her own. She landed the job. And that, I think, is a really interesting balance. And I can even say that, I had that experience as well. The first professional job I got was because my dad worked at the company that hired me. I still had to prove that I could be held on for the job. I had to interview. Actually, I had the whole deal was it was only supposed to be like a 4-month contract where I went and cleaned up inventory, and I didn't intend to stay, and they were going to rehire, and it just worked out that I ended up staying. And I've had situations throughout my career where my dad has gone with me for moral support. The first children's book contract that I signed, he went with me to the big expo and then sat or walked around the trade show floor while I went and had my interview with the editor and signed the contract. And so I think that there are really beneficial ways for parents to be involved and support their kids through the job development process. And some of the stories that we're going to share about how the horses do this in the herd really kind of dovetail with that, using the network, being there for support, but then giving that final push to do it on your own.
Yeah. And, I think that example of the marketing executive who utilized his LinkedIn network, right, to put something out. So to me, I don't see that as helicopter parenting.
No.
Right? Because he's not telling people to hire his daughter. he's not going to the interviews with her and sitting there with her, right? He's not talking to the hiring people. To me, that's very different, because I don't see that as any different than you putting out something to your network or me putting out something to my network for you, right? As professionals, of us promoting each other's work or promoting each other as coaches or whatever that is. So I think it is a great segue, because this is about providing guidance on how to navigate through the adult world, right? That you're now in. And so, with horses, just a little bit of context. So I worked at a breeding farm for a long time. And so every year we had a lot of baby horses that came along. And my job was to prepare them to be successful in the human world. And so I worked very closely with, teaching them things that they needed to know. However, I also got to observe all the time, because we would put the mother horses with their babies. They went out together in herds, and so you would have multiple mother horses with multiple babies out together. And it is just a really, really great way to observe how this process happens. So, for example, I would see a baby horse that would be, they're playing and things like that. And sometimes they'll like bring their front legs up and put it on top of their mother's back. and, and sometimes, the mother horses are like, okay, that's fine. But then there comes a point in time where the mother horse needs to say, I don't want you to do that, because that young horse needs to learn that what you do with your mother is not necessarily going to be acceptable with other horses in the herd. And what happens is that mother horse will start to communicate through body language to that young horse that behavior is not acceptable. Now, what's really interesting is when that young horse goes and does it to another mother horse that is not their mother. And she says, oh no, that is not acceptable. and she will be very clear. So she will turn her head around and she may nip at that young horse. She'll, swing her body, whatever it is. And these are consistent messages. And I think this is something that's important for us to think about, is there's consistent messaging to the young horses of when play is play, and that's good, and you need to do that, and when you're behaving in a way that is not conducive to the health, harmony, unity of the herd. They can't learn those things if those adult horses don't set boundaries for them. And in the wild, and even in some herds, I just saw a herd a couple weeks ago. I was visiting a ranch out here, and the stallion that is part of that herd, he lives out there with the mares and the foals. And I watched him give some direction to those young horses when they were, starting to wander off a little bit too far away from the herd. And so, I'm wondering, how can we do some of those things? How can we think that way in preparing, our younger workers to know how to navigate some of these things, and so that they're not dependent on their parents helping out, but also so that they're prepared for what happens when something that I'm wanting doesn't work out the way I want it to.
Mm-hmm. And as I mentioned before, I don't have kids, so I don't get to practice these things in my life every day, but I'm part of a number of business development groups where we have some very experienced mentors and coaches, and they talk about bringing their coaching, what they share with coaching, into these family parent situations. And families that have hired a coach for their young career in child have really noted a difference between how much it's helped with some of the resilience and being able to deal with a little bit of rejection or the persistence and the uncomfort. And when I think about it that way, it reminds me of what I've seen with my own horses here, we've only had one baby horse and he had to live in a herd with older horses, but it was the same. Like that, one of the older horses in the herd, Taco, was like that coach for him. When he and his mom were weaned, so he wasn't completely by her side,
Mm-hmm.
Taco was that one that allowed him to have that play, showed him what boundaries look like. And Taco was really tolerant, right? Like the role of a coach, kind of
Mm-hmm.
questioning, let the exploration. But then when Taco had had enough, there was a good, nip on the butt or a pin of the
Mm-hmm.
ears. And Winston just knew, okay, I got to give him a little bit of a break. And so sometimes I think, too, bringing in people who are outside of the situation can be incredibly helpful because there's not that same level of emotion attached, and that outside perspective that can say, this is helpful, this is helpful, this is helpful. Okay, you've crossed the line, come back, reset, and go in another direction.
Right. And I think that's really an important piece to look at with it, right? Is that just because one of the older herd members gives some direction to the younger herd member, it doesn't mean that they're being punished. It doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with them. It doesn't mean that they're a failure. It's guidance, and that's what I think would be the most helpful thing for us to be looking at in how we prepare the next generation to be ready to lead. And so, in the other article that I shared about the interns are running the show this summer, there's a lot of companies who are doing that. They're bringing in their interns, which are normal programs for paid internships, but now with AI, a lot of the things that interns would have done in the past is now being done by AI. And so these younger workers are being put into more responsible positions more quickly, like giving presentations to senior level people. There was one young woman who all of a sudden got told, "Hey, we need you to go to London tomorrow to do some social media marketing because our person that was going to do it can't go." And so this, young 20s person, she got on the plane, flew to London, did their marketing thing, and then flew back. Like she was gone for like 2 days. And but the work she did though showed her ability, and so right, their numbers were up with marketing content and that type of thing. But it's interesting. I would love to talk to that young woman and learn more about what made you feel like you could say yes to that,
Mm-hmm.
right? To get on a plane by yourself and fly. Now, maybe she had traveled, previously, growing up, and so not a big deal. But also being asked to step into that kind of a role when she's like, "I'm just an intern."
Right.
But somewhere along the line, someone prepared her to be okay with stepping into that unknown.
Mm-hmm. And I think that that's such an important point to make as well. Somebody did prepare her to step into that, and I would love to know what she feels contributed to that. But I
Mm-hmm.
also think it's important when we've talked about generational stereotyping in previous episodes.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody assumes that Gen Z doesn't want that they want the hand holding, they want the trophy. And they push back on that. They want to have the opportunities. And so I think it's really fascinating. Although I think there are a lot of downsides to AI, I think that's fascinating that it's creating some of these early career experiences for young people. And how do we help them prepare for those really, interesting and exciting opportunities that could come down the road for them?
Yeah, absolutely. And so what that makes me think of is, how we can parallel some of this, right? So in the herd, um, the older horses are always looking at, is this a lesson that this younger horse can survive and grow from whatever's happening, or is there a genuine risk to their safety and well-being? Because I have also watched mares and stallions be pretty proactive in protecting the younger members of their herd. And so, and sometimes that's because the younger member of the herd has maybe wandered off and got a little too curious about something that they shouldn't be curious about. And so, being able to discern that is something that horses are very good at. The other thing is that, when mares are around the younger horses, and they do take turns. Sometimes the younger horses are with mares that aren't their mother. They babysit each other's babies and protect them. But sometimes they will intervene pretty quickly and just kind of redirect. Right. It may not be something, they don't start panicking, being like, oh my God, what are you doing? Don't go over there. But, she may come in pretty clearly and say, oh, we need to go over here now. And so the correction, and even if this is something that the young horse is behaving in a way that is not conducive to the health, harmony, unity of the herd, the corrections are proportionate to what's happening. Mm-hmm. And so, it may just be that they move their ears, which in horse language can mean all kinds of different things depending on where their ears are going. And young horses learn very quickly what those things mean. But it's also, it happens and then it's over. Right? It kind of goes back to, we had an episode where we talked about going back to grazing after having a difficult conversation. And that's really what happens. It's not something that gets relitigated over and over and over again. Like, remember last week when you did that thing and that didn't work out. So there's always this, I think, a combination of protection in parallel with guidance. I don't know, if that's kind of the way that you look at it, Katie, but how might that translate over then for, parents and mentors or adults in general who want to help their younger workers be successful?
Yeah, I feel like there are so many parallels there, and I could share, endless stories of what's even happened in my herd this week. But we don't want to keep everyone for such a long time. But I would say really, for parents and mentors who are listening, to ask questions before making the phone call or sending the email or sitting in on the interview. Find out from the young adult that is in your life, what do they want? Because it might just be advice or to be a sounding board or even to vent, because sometimes there doesn't need to be an answer. There just needs to be an opportunity to explore what has happened.
Yeah.
And so I think that that's one thing is, especially in coaching, we talk a lot about listening and asking open-ended questions that are more than yes and no, and then just let that person share. And sometimes that's the outcome that they need.
Absolutely. Well, and I think if you are someone in a leadership role who might be navigating this, if you have a parent who is trying to insert themselves with your employee, just encourage your employee to, come and speak to you themselves. I think you have to acknowledge and say, hey, I understand that that your parents want you to be successful. And even if it's talking to the parents, hey, I understand that you want your child to, to be successful here. And what's going to be most helpful to them is for them to come and have a conversation with me. And I'm open to doing that in a way that's not threatening, kind of thing. I think also setting aside assumptions. We talked a little bit about one of the people that was in the Wall Street Journal article that was the newer graduate and said, hey, we don't really want this happening. We know it makes our generation look bad. Right. And so if some of this is happening, if there's a dynamic there happening, don't assume that the employee wants this to be happening. Mm-hmm. And that to me is kind of the opportunity potentially, right? To say, hey, I'm going to let's go have coffee. Right. And taking that young worker into an environment where you can just have a conversation with them and start to build some psychological safety so that they do know that they can maybe share with you and say, listen, I'm really sorry about this going on. And so that to me also is an opportunity to think about how can you as a leader build in small safe opportunities for younger workers to make independent decisions earlier on in their career, because that's going to be the key. If we're looking at if companies are putting younger workers into roles with more responsibility more quickly, and they're not prepared to have to make decisions in those situations, then that's on us as leaders. So we have a responsibility that if we're going to utilize AI to take care of some of these more basic entry level tasks, then we also have an opportunity to make sure that we are coaching and preparing those younger workers to be able to step into the responsibilities that we're asking them to take. So you got to decide. You can't have it both ways. You can't say we're going to spend all this money on AI but we're not going to train people. And that is a conversation, Katie, that I think we want to have in another episode, because we talked about it for this one. And I think that would be a really cool one to unpack.
I think it would be a really cool one to unpack as well. And as you were sharing that, Ginny, it reminded me, we rode in a clinic this summer with our horse that's 6, so still pretty young in his learning career. And what really stood out to me that I think applies here is in horse training, there can be 2 kind of schools of thought. And one is that you desensitize the horse so that they become comfortable through repeated exposure to the same thing over and over again. Mm-hmm. The challenge with that is they become desensitized to that one object, and then they can't process through a different situation that may cause a level of discomfort for them. Right. And so this clinic was about, how do you teach that resilience? How do you teach that curiosity to try something new, whether it's a flag or a tarp or water or a bubble maker. And so that when they get into those situations, because we cannot plan for everything that a young person will experience in their career, especially if we're putting them in those roles early, or right. the horses in the herd or riding or the work that we do. And so I think that that's really important too, is really digging into, what helps you feel supported? How can we help you grow? What would you have done differently if you feel it didn't go the way it should? All of those things that help build in that muscle memory for what happens when I get into a new situation.
Absolutely. And I love, looking at it through that lens of, again, coming back to the preparation piece. And, we have to be able to set some boundaries, right? We have to help younger members of our workforce learn how to set boundaries and how to understand what those are and why they're there. But we also have to be willing to protect them when that's needed, right? And that's what the herd has taught me in watching these behaviors play out and these interactions is there's always a combination of discern what's happening, and does this require some guidance around boundaries, or does this require a little bit more protection so that then we can guide. And so we have to be able to know what moment we're in as leaders. In particular, is this a moment where this younger employee needs me to protect them some, because you may need to do that if you have other people in the organization who are making assumptions about younger workers, et cetera. As a leader, you may need to step in to protect them in some way. And also you may need to provide some guidance at some point in time and like, hey, I know you want to do this, but you're not quite ready yet. But let me figure out how I can help you get there. And so my hope is that that some of this conversation gets people thinking about, how do you perceive younger workers that are in your company or that are on your team, and how might you explore this a little bit for wondering, do they need some guidance right now, or do they need some protection?
I think that's a great thought to end on, right?
It is. So we hope that you enjoyed the episode and the conversation. And if you have any comments, we would love to hear those. So you can drop them to us. You can check out more episodes at leadingwithinstinct.com, and we're out on all of your favorite podcast platforms. But in the meantime, as you're continuing to move forward, remember to stay grounded, stay connected, and always lead with instinct.
This has been the Leading with Instinct podcast, focusing on intuitive leadership and fostering deep team connections through equine experiential leadership development and coaching. The Leading with Instinct podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Collaboration Partners, harnessing the collective human potential in organizations since 2009, providing equine experiential learning for lasting change. Get in touch at thecollaborationpartners.com, and by katiethecoach.com, helping entrepreneurs and business leaders reset, reconnect, and reframe to live their best professional and personal lives. Visit katiethecoach.com for more information. For more information about equine experiential development and coaching and the Leading with Instinct podcast, visit www.leadingwithinstinct.com. The Leading with Instinct podcast is available at leadingwithinstinct.com, on the Leading with Instinct YouTube channel, and wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Subscribe today, and thank you for listening to the Leading with Instinct podcast.